We continue following developments in Capitol Hill, where the House of Representatives is one step closer to voting on a motion or resolution to remove Kevin McCarthy from his leadership position. I want to bring in for more CBS News congressional correspondent Scott MacFarlane. He's in the Capitol. He's in Capitol Hill. Scott, so talk to us about what's happening now. We're seeing on screen that there are at least 10 Republicans who are voting against this motion that was filed by McCarthy himself to table the initial resolution, trying to give a bit of a summary here so people don't think that this is the final vote to oust McCarthy. So talk to us about what's happening now, and from the votes and where they stand, what is it looking like?
As it stands now, Lilia, we're one step closer to seeing something that's never been seen in American history, the ousting of a sitting U.S. House Speaker. The vote you're watching is a critical test vote ahead of this attempt to oust Kevin McCarthy. You see on the top of the screen it says motion to table, which is a parliamentary term for trying to stop the ouster of Kevin McCarthy, and that attempt to stop it has failed. 10 Republicans joining all voting Democrats who are voting in unison today to knock that down, which sets the table for something bigger later this afternoon. A motion to vacate, this motion to kick Kevin McCarthy out of the speakership. There is no indication the vote on that will change from this test vote. Now 11 Republicans have voted against this motion. That will include members of the Freedom Caucus who have been unambiguous with their criticisms of Kevin McCarthy ever since January, ever since that extended 15-round vote to make McCarthy the speaker. That would include Florida's Matt Gaetz, who helped launch this motion to vacate earlier this week. It also includes a few Republican Freedom Caucus members who've been especially critical of Kevin McCarthy cutting a deal with the White House to end the debt ceiling crisis in May and cutting a deal with Democrats to keep the government open on Saturday. The next vote, the timing is unclear. There can be a parliamentary procedure employed, Lilia. They could make a motion to adjourn the House. They could make a motion to recess the House, which is a lot like adjourning it. They can make a motion to refer all of this to some obscure congressional committee. But the bottom line remains the same. There has to be a vote on the House floor to do any of those things. And there's no indication the dynamics you see in this vote will change at all as this day proceeds. So Kevin McCarthy is in grave danger of being stripped of his speakership, which doesn't preclude him from running for it again, because there'll need to be a new speaker elected. But this is quite a statement never made before by the U.S. House of Representatives.
So if we see this as a practice run, and what ends up happening is that Kevin McCarthy is effectively ousted, you're saying this is a historic thing, this has never happened before. But how did we get here to the point that one member of Congress, and just take us back to his confirmation as the speaker, and what went into all of that, and why is it that one member of Congress can bring us to this historic moment?
This type of vote has felt inevitable since January, that there was going to be some challenge to Kevin McCarthy fomented at some point. He made a concession in January, Lilia, to win the speakership, to win over some of the faction of House conservatives who had opposed him, that yes, he will allow any single member to bring this motion anytime during Congress. That was one of the concessions he gave them, and they have utilized that concession here today. The debt ceiling deal that Kevin McCarthy cut with the White House, which helped avoid a default on America's debt and an economic catastrophe, rankled a lot of the Republicans who'd opposed him at first. Then, on Saturday, when he made this vote, for which all, or nearly all, Democrats voted in favor to avoid a government shutdown, he rankled some of those conservatives again. It was a bridge too far for some of those who opposed him at first in January. This all felt predetermined, that it was a destination we were always going to go down to watch Kevin McCarthy fight for his job. The outcome of this vote wasn't really clear until the voting began, although you could sense, you could feel the pessimism from the speaker when we talked to him today, and to his most loyal supporters when we talked to them today ahead of the vote.
Let's take a listen. It seems like it's official.
Pursuant to Clause 2A2 of Rule 9, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Gaetz, and the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Nikole, will each control 30 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield such time as he may consume to my colleague from Virginia, Mr. Good.
Gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Good, is recognized for such time as he may consume. And before the gentleman speaks, may I remind my colleagues that all parties need to be heard. Would you please clear the well and clear the aisles and any extraneous conversations need to be taken from the floor.
Scott, can you walk us through what we're about to hear?
I believe what you're about to see is the hour of debate that has been budgeted for the bigger question, the motion to vacate, the motion, the next vote, which would be to oust Kevin McCarthy. I'm not a betting man. If I were a betting man, though, Lily, I'd put the mortgage on the bet that this is going to be more than an hour, that they're going to go well beyond the estimated time frame for this debate. Both Speaker McCarthy and the House Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries are given unlimited budgets of time to speak during floor debates. And it would be surprised if we didn't hear from one or both of them during this hour. The man you're hearing from, sitting next to Matt Gaetz, or standing next to Matt Gaetz, is Virginia Congressman Bob Good, a House Freedom Caucus member from Central Virginia. He has been among the most ardent opponents of Kevin McCarthy this Congress. He never voted in favor of Kevin McCarthy's speakership. He has towed almost as hard a line as Matt Gaetz has. So these remarks coming from Bob Good will not be a surprise. They will be critical of McCarthy. They will call for the ouster of Kevin McCarthy.
I want to bring in and join this panel Nikole Killion. Nikole, talk to us about what we saw just there in terms of the voting. All of the Democrats voted against tabling this motion. Basically, as Scott put it, if this is a practice run, we would count on every Democrat voting to oust Kevin McCarthy. So talk to us about what the tone, what the mood has been, and what's in it for Democrats in Congress to get rid of McCarthy.
Well, Democrats made clear coming out of their caucus meeting this morning that they were going to be unified. Time and again, that was the message that emanated from various members. And they basically said that they intended to stick together. So to your point, if we see this motion to vacate go forward, now that this vote to table it has failed, meaning they will try to move forward with this vote, then it is not a good sign for Speaker Kevin McCarthy. But that being said, you know, Speaker McCarthy likes to look at the glass half full. And, you know, this kind of takes us back to right where we were in January, where we went through those 15 rounds. And I really feel like people at home are probably seeing what I saw on midnight. I think it was Saturday, on early in January, where, you know, you're just seeing this live and in person as they debate whether the speaker should stay or go. And we heard a lot of these same arguments earlier this year. We're likely to hear more of them now. But I think from the viewpoint of Democrats, that is why they're kind of hanging together on this one. And they hung together in early January as well, but primarily because they feel that this is of Republicans' own doing, and they need to figure this out for themselves.
So, Nikole, do you think that there's any candidates for speakership that Democrats in Congress would stand behind?
I think it remains to be seen. I mean, certainly some of the names we've heard floated are some of the current Republican leaders, deputies to Speaker Kevin McCarthy, whether that's Majority Leader Steve Scalise or GOP Whip Tom Emmer. But obviously, you know, they work very closely with Speaker McCarthy, so unclear if their leadership would be any different if they were to be elected. But again, pretty premature to make those kinds of predictions until we kind of see how these procedures play out.
Well, I want to play out a little bit of the debate that's going on there. Let's take a listen.
That was the limit, save, grow levels, radically, historically, saving $100 billion and lowering the deficit this year under Republican majority from $2.2 trillion to $2.1 trillion. That's what we were asking the Republican House to do, to go to $2.1 trillion. Meanwhile, the Speaker had committed to bring a balanced budget vote to this floor, something that still has not happened, despite the work that's been done in our budget committee to mark it up and have it ready to come to the floor. He also promised that we would bring all 12 appropriation bills well before the September 30 fiscal deadline. We did not. We simply, as Republicans, needed the Speaker to cast the vision, request the support of the entire conference, all of whom voted for the limit, save, grow levels, except for 4 who wanted to go even further, to lead us in joining him, sticking with him, supporting him in sending the most conservative spending bills with the most conservative cuts possible to the Senate as the best starting position for negotiations with the Senate. Many of us begged and pleaded with the Speaker to do that over the past 5 months. When the Speaker failed us to pass our spending bills, bringing only one of 12 to the floor before the August district work period, members began to negotiate amongst themselves without the Speaker to find compromise. I was among those who reluctantly agreed last month to split the difference between failed responsibilities 1.586 and the limit save grow 1.471. I reluctantly agreed to do that, to go to 1.526 in order to pass our bills on to the Senate. We then essentially forced the Speaker, with the pressure of the calendar, the debt ceiling, or excuse me, the shutdown threat of the calendar, to bring those 4 bills to the floor last week, all of which I voted for, despite some of them not cutting to the levels we'd agreed to and other concerns I had with the bills. I reluctantly voted for the 30-day conditional CR, or continuing resolution, because it cut an additional $10 billion in the month of October, going back to the pre-COVID 1.471 levels for defense, non-defense discretionary, 30%, and it had border security. I voted for that. However, when that vote failed, the Speaker this past Friday in the Republican conference meeting made it abundantly clear that he was willing to do anything to avoid the temporary discomfort and the pressure of a pause in the 15% of the non-essential federal government operations, which would guarantee that we would lose to the Senate Democrats and the White House. If you're not willing to say no, then you're guaranteed to lose. And that was confirmed with the passage of the unconditional 45-day CR this past Saturday, once again with 209 Democrat votes. The Republican bill, 209-1 Democrats, 51-0 in the Senate side. The Speaker fought through 15 votes in January to become Speaker, but was only willing to fight through one failed CR before surrendering to the Democrats on Saturday. We need a Speaker who will fight for something, anything, besides just staying or becoming Speaker. If there was ever a time to fight, with $33 trillion in national debt, a $2 trillion deficit this year, 40-year high inflation, 20-year high interest rates, a downgraded credit rating, and for the first time in modern history, the polls showing, despite all the help of the media blaming Republicans in the House, the polls showed that the public was blaming Biden and the Democrats for an imminent shutdown. If not fight now, when would we fight? Now is and was the time. With the Democrats driving the fiscal bus off the cliff at 100 miles an hour, we cannot simply be content to be the party that slows it down to 95 just so we can sit in the front seat and wear the captain's hat. Our current debt and our spending trajectory is unsustainable. We need a Speaker, ideally somebody who doesn't want to be Speaker and hasn't pursued that at all costs for his entire adult life, who will meet the moment and do everything possible to fight for the country. A red line was crossed for me, I regret, on Saturday, and chose regret that I must vote against the motion to table as I did and to vote to vacate the chair. And I yield back.
Gentleman from Florida reserves his time. Gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I share one thing in common with my friend from Virginia. This is a very sad day, and certainly a day I never expected to have to live through. You know, I think broadly speaking, as I look across this floor, you can divide members into 3 groups. I'm very happy to be in the first group. The overwhelming majority of my party supports.
Okay, we have been listening to members of Congress debate why members of the GOP, especially those from the Freedom Caucus, are voting or against a resolution that House Speaker Kevin McCarthy put forward to essentially save his seat after the representative from Florida, Matt Gaetz, filed a resolution to oust him from power. I want to bring in Scott MacFarlane, who has been breaking this all down for us. Scott, we are living in a time where the polarization in Congress and across the country is impossible to ignore. At a time when even though democracy is something that does not signify the rule of the few, it seems like the loudest are the ones that are able to do things like what we're seeing right now happen and disrupt the whole process. I'd love to go back to January a little bit and for you to explain to us from where you stand and what you've witnessed, how this small group of far-right Republicans have impacted the way politics has played out during this entire year and just the inability to get to a compromise, which is what happens in a democracy.
Lilia, this feels so similar to what we watched hour after hour in that chamber in January. It has so many echoes of what we witnessed because it is a fundamental fight, not just over whether Kevin McCarthy should be Speaker, but a fight inside the Republican Party over what to do with the power of the majority in the U.S. House. Same voices making symmetrical arguments. It feels as if this day was a destination the House Republicans were always headed toward. The vote was so narrow, and the vote took so long in January to elect Kevin McCarthy Speaker, and the opposition inside his own party was so vibrant and vitriolic at times, it felt like this day was coming, just a matter of when. And you heard Congressman Good of Virginia, who's been, again, the most strident or among the most strident McCarthy critics among Republicans, say he's criticizing the deals, the agreements Kevin McCarthy, he says, reached to avert the government shutdown, and some Republicans are concerned about the deal he cut with the White House to avert the debt ceiling crisis. But that's what you've been hearing this week. As this vote was being prepared, concern about agreements or deals and a lack of transparency from Kevin McCarthy, according to his fellow Republicans. Yesterday, Congressman Gaetz of Florida, who was seated next to Mr. Good and who was the one who introduced this motion, was criticizing what he said was some secret deal cut between Speaker McCarthy and the White House over future funding to help Ukraine in its war effort. McCarthy told me there was no secret deal. There was no deal cut with the White House. But it's those agreements that they allege and that they seem to be holding as issues as they move toward this ultimate vote, potentially to oust McCarthy. It's also not clear, as this day develops, who the alternative would be. There's been no consensus as to who is Plan B. Who would stand in if Kevin McCarthy were forced to stand down? That's always been the leverage Kevin McCarthy wields. It was in January when he won on the 15th vote, when we watched a scene just like this. There was no reasonable or conceivable alternative that could get the votes of a majority of House members. That same dynamic exists right now, and maybe how Kevin McCarthy can bounce back from whatever happens next.
So we're going to go back in there to listen to Matt Gaetz, who's the person that initiated, who triggered this vote to oust McCarthy. Let's listen to what he has to say.
House Democrats and many of us on the conservative side of the Republican caucus would argue is that the thing we have in common, Kevin McCarthy said something to all of us at one point or another that he didn't really mean and never intended to live up to. I don't think voting against Kevin McCarthy is chaos. I think $33 trillion in debt is chaos. I think that facing a $2.2 trillion annual deficit is chaos. I think that not passing single subject spending bills is chaos. I think the fact that we have been governed in this country since the mid-90s by continuing resolution and omnibus is chaos. And the way to liberate ourselves from that is a series of reforms to this body that I would hope would outlast Speaker McCarthy's time here, would outlast my time here, and would outlast either of our majorities. Reforms that I have heard some of the most conservative members of this body fight for, and some of the reforms that we've been battling for that I've even heard those in the Democrat caucus say would be worthy and helpful to the House, like open amendments, like understanding what the budget is. We have been out of compliance with budget laws for most of my life, most of many of your lives. And by the way, if we did those things, if we had single subject bills, if we had an understanding on the top line, if we had open amendments, if we had trust and honesty and understanding, there would be times when my conservative colleagues and I would lose, might be a few times when we'd win. There'd be times that we would form partnerships that might otherwise not be really predictable in the American body politic, but the American people would see us legislating. These last few days, we've suspended the momentum that we had established the week earlier, where we were bringing bills to the floor, voting on them, staying late at night, working hard. That's what the American people expect. It's something Speaker McCarthy hasn't delivered, and that's why I've moved to vacate the chair. I reserve.
Gentleman's time is reserved. Gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to my very good friend, Mr. Emmer from Minnesota.
Gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Emmer, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you. Kevin McCarthy has earned this. Under Speaker McCarthy's leadership, our House Republican majority has actually defied all odds and overperformed expectations again and again and again. It all started with a speaker's race, when our Speaker, Kevin McCarthy, showed the American people how he would never give up. It carried over into the Speaker spearheading a rules package to create the most transparent, member-driven legislative process that I've ever seen since I've been here. And since then, Speaker McCarthy's Republican majority has been successful in bringing common sense back to our nation's capital by passing legislation to affirm a parent's right to be involved in their child's education, bolster American energy production, fully fund veterans' care and benefits, fight back against the regulatory state, and continue delivering on our promise to rein in Democrats' reckless spending by passing fiscally responsible appropriations bills. We've also achieved historic conservative wins, like passing the strongest border security legislation in history, passing the first Republican-only NDAA.
You have been listening to a debate among members of the House of Representatives, those who support Kevin McCarthy's speakership and those who fiercely oppose it and are trying to remove him from that seat. I want to bring in CBS News congressional correspondent Nikole Killion. Nikole, we just heard Matt Gaetz, who is the person who filed that resolution, who triggered this vote that's now being debated on. Talk to us about what is it that Matt Gaetz is trying to achieve. What I heard from him is a message about a need for an entire overhaul of the way that voting happens in Congress. So talk to us about specifically what led to this point and what, from your perspective, is he trying to achieve?
Well, at the end of the day, he thinks that Speaker McCarthy has gone back on his word to conservatives and to uphold conservative principles. And you heard him there say that I don't think voting against Kevin McCarthy is chaos. I think $33 trillion in debt is chaos. You know, he talked about the fact that, you know, Congress so often has been doing these continuing resolutions instead of passing their appropriations bills, saying that that is chaos. You know, he believes that legislation should be single subject, just focusing on one piece of policy instead of looping a bunch of issues together. He thinks that is chaos. So he has called for a number of reforms, basically, in how the House and Congress operates. And so that is his argument. He feels that the Speaker has failed to deliver, not only in upholding some of the promises that he made, but in just helping to carry out the business of Congress. You know, again, a lot of the gripes that some Republicans had, and you heard this a bit from Bob Good as well, it kind of goes back to most recently that debt limit deal that was struck between the Speaker and the White House. So, you know, many conservative Republicans feel that the Speaker gave up too much and that he really didn't fight hard enough to really hold the line on spending levels. And so that's kind of, this fight has resurrected now in this appropriations process, because during that debt limit fight, of course, one of the compromises was that both chambers needed to move back to what's called regular order, where they passed the 12 appropriations bills to fund various agencies in the government. And again, that process is underway. But as you heard some members say, we're behind the 8 ball here. We should have been further along with this. That was the Speaker's job, and we're not there yet. And that's part of why we ended up in the fight over the temporary spending bill last week, because they needed that stopgap to be able to finish their work with respect to appropriations. So just on multiple levels, many of these hardliners feel that the Speaker really hasn't lived up to his worth in terms of how they feel he should conduct himself, not only in governing, but also serving as the leader of House Republicans. Now, you also heard from Congressman Tom Cole, who heads Rules, who called this a very sad day. You also heard from GOP Whip Tom Emmer, who is a deputy of Speaker McCarthy, tried to tout what he feels are the accomplishments that the Speaker has made in terms of having a more transparent rules package, and in terms of promoting the agenda of House Republicans, which stems from this long commitment to America blueprint that House Republicans laid out in the last election, on issues of border security and parents' rights and increasing energy production and cutting regulation, all those priorities. You heard Whip Emmer say, the Speaker has been trying to deliver. So this is that push and pull, that argument that you were hearing from members both for the Speaker and against the Speaker as they try to debate whether or not he should stay in his job.